you to the Michigan Law School Federalist Society for having me here, and Claire Booth Luce, Center for Conservative Women. I'm honored to be sponsored by both of you, and I'm very grateful to Professor McQuaid for taking time out to speak with me today about an issue that stays in the news every single day. Let me state at the outset that the police have an indefeasible obligation to treat everyone they meet with courtesy and respect. Too often, cops develop a hostile, in-your-face attitude that is off-putting and is a violation of their public trust. They need constant training in getting rid of those rough edges that frankly develop in many cases by the treatment they get in the streets, but it's not to excuse any kind of peremptory attitude towards civilians. They also need constant retraining in tactics. Cops are desperate for more hands-on tactical training that will minimize the chance that they find themselves in a high-stress, high-risk situation where they don't have backup. I know cops in Chicago that pay for their own training because they're not getting enough of it from their police departments. And it is also the case that there have been some bad shootings over the years. Every time an innocent civilian is killed by a cop, it is a stomach-churning tragedy. But I don't know any police department that is not trying to avoid those bad shootings with everything it's got. And frankly, the number of clearly bad shootings are infinitesimal compared to the about 375 million civilian contacts that, by one estimate, cops have every year. Now, the dominant narrative about policing today, that it's infected with lethal bias, that Black parents are right to fear that every time their child steps outdoors, he may be killed by a cop. That narrative is not just false, but it's dangerous, and it's having lethal consequences. For the last 2 decades, we've been talking in public discourse obsessively about phantom police racism in order not to talk about a far more consequential and much more uncomfortable problem, which is highly elevated rates of Black crime. And as long as that Black crime rate remains so disproportional, policing is going to be viewed wrongly through the lens of race. Let me give you some numbers. Last year saw the largest one-year increase on a percentage basis in homicide in this nation's history. 95% increase in homicides in Milwaukee, 78% in Louisville, 72% in Minneapolis. The list goes on and on. An additional 2,000 Americans were killed last year compared to 2019, most of them Black. That disproportion is typical. The majority of homicide victims every year are Black, even though Blacks are only 12% of the nation's population. Blacks between the ages of 10 and 43 die of homicide at 13 times the rate of whites. That is a problem. It is arguably a civil rights problem. Who is killing those Blacks that die at 13 times the rate of whites? Not the police, not whites, but other Blacks. Last year, dozens of children were killed in drive-by shootings. Almost all of those children were Black. I'm going to give you a small sample of last year's killings, just so you get a sense of what's going on a daily basis in this country and what is not getting covered. These are gruesome and disturbing stories and anecdotes, facts, but I think you need to confront them in order to understand the reality of policing today. These are only from very early October to mid-June, and it's a mere handful of the killings that occurred last year. On October 3rd in Sacramento, California, a 9-year-old girl was killed during a family gathering in a park. Her 6-year-old cousin and aunt were also shot. 2 hours later, a 17-year-old crashed into a pole in his car after being fatally shot. On September 26th, a 15-year-old boy was fatally shot in the head in the far west side of Chicago. On September 22nd, a 3-year-old boy in Orlando, Florida, was fatally shot in the head while playing in his living room when a passing car sprayed bullets at the front door and windows of the home. The day before, a 14-year-old boy in the same neighborhood was killed with a shot to his head while he was sitting on his front porch. A 15-year-old next to him was critically wounded. On September 21, a 1-year-old boy in Kansas City, Missouri, was killed when someone walked up to the car in which he was riding and riddled it with bullets. The victim, Tyrone Patton, was among the 13 children who had been killed in shootings through late September in Kansas City. A 15-year-old girl was shot to death in St. Louis on September 15th. On September 11th, a 14-year-old boy was killed in a drive-by shooting in Northeast Baltimore, part of a burst of violence that killed 12 people and wounded 45 others over 6 days. On September 10th, a female mail carrier on the far south side of Chicago was fatally shot in the head, abdomen, legs, and buttocks by occupants of a car speeding down the street. On September 9th, an 11-year-old girl in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, was shot in the face, answering a knock on the back door of her home. A 7-year-old girl was killed on August 29th while at a family birthday party in South Bend, Indiana. The assailants shot from a passing car. August 17th, 9-year-old shot in the head in a car on the south side of Chicago. August 12th, 14-year-old boy opened the door of his mother's apartment in St. Louis in response to a knock and was fatally shot in the head. On the morning of August 11th, an 11-year-old girl was shot in the head in an SUV in Madison, Wisconsin. 2 days later, her family took her off life support. August 1, a 7-year-old boy shot in the head while sitting on his family's front porch in West Philadelphia. The boy died 2 days later. July 2nd, 22nd. 1-year-old Ace Lucas killed in his bed in Canton, Ohio. His twin brother sleeping next to him was wounded. I'm going to skip to July 4th weekend, where there were at least 8 children killed nationally. They included 8-year-old Secoria Turner, who was in a car with her mother in Atlanta, trying to inch past a barricade illegally erected by Black Lives Matter protesters. 2 people opened fire on the car, killing Secoria. Michael Goodlaw, age 4, fatally shot in the head on July 4th in St. Louis. In Hoover, Alabama, a gun battle broke out at a mall. Royda Giles, 8-year-old, was caught in the crossfire and killed. Gallivants Ferry, South Carolina, a 4-year-old boy killed on July 4th. Devon McNeil, 11, on July 4th, ran towards his aunt's house in Southeast Washington, D.C. to get a cell phone charger, was killed in gunfire between a group of 5 males. In Chicago, over the same weekend, Natalia Wallace, 7, playing in a yard. 3 males exited a car, opened fire at a group. Over 50% of all victims of fatal police shootings, there's about 1,000 people killed by cops each year. It's been a remarkably stable number since it's been kept by the Washington Post database. Most of those victims are armed or otherwise dangerous. It turns out that whites and Hispanics, a greater percentage of white and Hispanic homicide victims are killed by a cop than Black homicide victims who are killed by a cop. Fully 10% of all whites and Hispanics who die of homicide are killed by a cop, compared to 3% of Black homicide victims who are killed by a cop. When it comes to unarmed victims of fatal police shootings, last year, according to the Washington Post database, there were 15 unarmed victims, Black victims of fatal police shootings, and 21 unarmed white victims of police shootings. The Washington Post defines unarmed very liberally to include suspects who are grabbing an officer's gun, beating him with it, escaping in a stolen car, resisting arrest. But given those numbers, we'll take them on face value, even though I think they're a bit of a stretch. Those 15 unarmed Black victims of fatal police shootings represent 0.17% of the likely 8,800 Blacks who were killed last year in criminal homicides. If even one shooting of an unarmed civilian who has not been in any way suggesting that he poses a threat to a cop and has to be a lethal threat is far too many, but it is not the epidemic that we've been told about. Nevertheless, Professor McQuaid is absolutely right to stress training to try and bring those numbers as low as they possibly can be. But we also never hear about the unarmed white victims of police shootings, fatal police shootings, because again, they don't fit the narrative. In 2016, there was an incident in Dallas, Texas, that adumbrated the George Floyd killing. A 33-year-old man named Tony Timpa called the Dallas cops and said he was off his medication for schizophrenia and was needing help. When they arrived, he was already put in handcuffs by employees at a store. The 3 Dallas cops kept him on his chest on the ground with handcuffed behind him for 13 minutes while he said 30 times that he was having trouble breathing and he was going to die. The officers joked about his mental condition even after he went silent, and his death was ruled a homicide due to the pressure on his back and a drug overdose, which is going to be probably pretty close to what we see for George Floyd. Am I justifying either of those killings? Absolutely not. I'm just saying this is not a race issue. Let me just throw out a few more numbers and then I will wrap it up and look forward to more of Professor McQuaid's response. We also hear a lot these days about white supremacy. Over the summer, LeBron James was routinely tweeting out that, you know, Blacks were being killed every time they walked out the door. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in their citizen criminal victimization survey, when you look at the entire universe of interracial violent crime, excluding homicide, because this is victim reported between Blacks and whites and Blacks, Blacks commit 88% of all interracial violence between whites and Blacks. A police officer is between 18 and 30 times more likely to be killed by a Black male than an unarmed Black male is to be killed by a cop. Black males have made up about 42% of all cop killers over the last decade, even though they're 6% of the population. So this narrative about police racism has consequences. I would argue that last year's homicide spike is as a result of the narrative cops are backing off of the type of proactive policing that gets guns off the streets and saves lives. The criminals know that their chances of being stopped now are very low, and they are carrying guns with much greater abandon. The coronavirus pandemic, I don't think, is at all a persuasive analysis or explanation for the crime spike we've seen. In fact, crime was going down globally and in the United States in the first 3 months of the pandemic, and it only went up, it reversed course only in the United States and only with regards to homicides and shootings after the anti-cop riots began. Everywhere else in the world, crime is still much lower than it was because of due to the pandemic. When cops back off, those thousands of law-abiding, good, hardworking residents of minority communities do not get the assistance they need. I have never been to a police community meeting in the South Bronx or Central Brooklyn or Central Harlem or South like Chicago when I have not heard some variant of the following pleas. You arrest the dealers, they're back on the street the next day. Get the kid, why are the kids allowed to hang out on the corner fighting? Whatever happened to truancy laws or loitering laws? People are smoking marijuana in my corridor. Why can't you do something about that? I've spoken to elderly ladies who are terrified to go down into their building lobby to get their mail because the lobbies are colonized by trespassing youth hanging out and selling drugs. Those are the voices that the police are responding to. And when they back off under a phony narrative of widespread systemic police racism, those are the people who most deserve police protection who are not getting it. People who understand that enforcing low-level public order offenses is essential It is not racist. It keeps violent crime under control as well. And it is what most people expect out of a civil environment. Can policing be improved? Should it be improved? Of course. De-escalation training, tactical training, all those should be done, and I hope will be done in the future. But right now, I would just insist that policing is not the biggest problem in the minority community. Crime is, and the best solution to that problem is the reconstruction of the family. Policing is at best a second best solution, but until we have stronger families and stronger informal social controls, police are going to continue to be needed, and they will be begged for their presence from the law-abiding residents of minority neighborhoods. So thank you very much, and I look forward to more interaction with Professor McQuaid, and thank you again for putting up with my blackout.